George Orwell, the closest thing to a prophet that atheism has ever produced. 1984. Everyone loves 1984. But before 1984, and before Animal Farm, Orwell wrote books and essays that you've never heard of. More importantly for this discussion, George Orwell wrote a book review of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf in 1940. In that review, Orwell explains something that had been very confusing to many people. People were wondering how someone like Adolf Hitler had risen to power in a place like Germany. Germany was the land of physicists and operas. How did such an enlightened nation end up with Hitler as leader? Orwell explains by drawing attention to a peculiar fact of human nature that, for some reason, most people still overlook. What's interesting is that this overlooked fact about human nature can help us understand the problems around us today. The United States of America is the most powerful, most prosperous nation the world has ever seen. And yet, as recent weeks have shown, many Americans want to burn this place to the ground. Why is that? I'll let Orwell answer. Now, the last paragraph of his book review is the paragraph I want to focus on, but the review isn't very long, and the rest of it contains some other interesting points, so I think we'll just read the entire thing. It's a little over 2 pages. It is a sign of the speed at which events are moving that Hearst and Blackett's unexpurgated edition of Mein Kampf, published only a year ago, is edited from a pro-Hitler angle. Hearst and Blackett was a British publishing company that put out the unexpurgated edition of Mein Kampf, the edition that didn't cut out the racist or otherwise offensive parts. The obvious intention of the translator's preface and notes is to tone down the book's ferocity and present Hitler in as kindly a light as possible. For at that date, Hitler was still respectable. He had crushed the German labor movement, and for that, the property-owning classes were willing to forgive him almost anything. Both left and right concurred in the very shallow notion that National Socialism was merely a version of conservatism. Again, this review by Orwell was written in 1940. World War II began in September of 1939. Before that, Hitler was still respectable, even in Great Britain. So much so that the British edition of Mein Kampf was meant to cast Hitler in a favorable light. So here's George Orwell after the outbreak of World War II saying, "Isn't it interesting that just a year ago, people in Great Britain were defending this guy?" Then suddenly it turned out that Hitler was not respectable after all. Understatement of the 20th century. As one result of this, Hearst and Blackett's edition was reissued in a new jacket explaining that all profits would be devoted to the Red Cross. That was their penance. Nevertheless, simply on the internal evidence of Mein Kampf, it is difficult to believe that any real change has taken place in Hitler's aims and opinions. So, Hitler didn't change at all. How did we go from defending him to despising him? When one compares his utterances of a year or so ago with those made 15 years earlier, a thing that strikes one is the rigidity of his mind, the way in which his worldview doesn't develop. It is the fixed vision of a monomaniac and not likely to be much affected by the temporary maneuvers of power politics. Probably, in Hitler's own mind, the Russo-German Pact represents no more than an alteration of timetable. The Russo-German Pact obviously was a treaty between the Russians and the Germans. They agreed on how to divide up Eastern Europe, and they agreed not to attack each other. It's normally called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In Mein Kampf, the main enemies of the Germans were said to be the Jews and the Communists. Hitler was going to fight the Russians. And yet, in 1939, Hitler made a pact with the Russians and decided to focus on Great Britain. Had Hitler changed his mind? Not at all. Orwell points out that Hitler doesn't change his mind. He simply alters his timetable. The plan laid down in Mein Kampf was to smash Russia first, with the implied intention of smashing England afterwards. Now, as it has turned out, England has got to be dealt with first because Russia was the more easily bribed of the two. But Russia's turn will come when England is out of the picture. That, no doubt, is how Hitler sees it. Whether it will turn out that way is, of course, a different question. Orwell is so confident that Hitler doesn't change his mind that he announces in 1940, while there's a non-aggression pact between the Russians and the Germans, that Hitler is going to attack the Russians. On June 22, 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. The goal was to provide living space for the German people, exactly as Hitler had said many years earlier in Mein Kampf. The good thing about evil people who don't change is that even if they're difficult to reason with, at least they're predictable. Suppose that Hitler's program could be put into effect. What he envisages 100 years hence is a continuous state of 250 million Germans with plenty of living room, i.e. stretching to Afghanistan or thereabouts, a horrible, brainless empire in which, essentially, nothing ever happens except the training of young men for war and the endless breeding of fresh cannon fodder. How was it that he was able to put this monstrous vision across? It is easy to say that at one stage of his career he was financed by the heavy industrialists, who saw in him the man who would smash the socialists and communists. They would not have backed him, however, if he had not talked a great movement into existence already. Again, the situation in Germany, with its 7 million unemployed, was obviously favorable for demagogues. But Hitler could not have succeeded against his many rivals if it had not been for the attraction of his own personality, which one can feel even in the clumsy writing of Mein Kampf, and which is no doubt overwhelming when one hears his speeches. Now, if you read an online version of this book review, here is where you'll see a ... The next two sentences are removed because they're too embarrassing for Orwell's fans. But if anyone should be opposed to removing a bit of history, it should be the fans of the man who wrote 1984. If you're not familiar with 1984, the main character, Winston Smith, works at the Ministry of Truth, where his job is to rewrite history to bring it in line with the government's latest propaganda. But we'll read the unexpurgated version of Orwell's review. See, we learned a new word, and then we used the word. Orwell declares, "I should like to put it on record that I have never been able to dislike Hitler." Oh my goodness. Ever since he came to power, till then, like nearly everyone, I had been deceived into thinking that he did not matter. I have reflected that I would certainly kill him if I could get within reach of him, but that I could feel no personal animosity. To be fair, we know things about Hitler that Orwell didn't know at the time. But it's pretty interesting that a literary genius who had an amazing knack for understanding how governments control and manipulate people could say that he just couldn't bring himself to dislike one of the worst people in history. Why is that? It's about to get creepier. The fact is that there is something deeply appealing about him. One feels it again when one sees his photographs, and I recommend especially the photograph at the beginning of Hearst and Blackett's edition, which shows Hitler in his early brown shirt days. This is the picture Orwell is referring to. This is the 1939 edition of Mein Kampf, where the editors tried to portray Hitler as favorably as possible. It is a pathetic, dog-like face, the face of a man suffering under intolerable wrongs. In a rather more manly way, it reproduces the expression of innumerable pictures of Christ crucified, and there is little doubt that that is how Hitler sees himself. The initial personal cause of his grievance against the universe can only be guessed at, but at any rate, the grievance is there. He is the martyr, the victim, Prometheus chained to the rock, the self-sacrificing hero who fights single-handed against impossible odds. If he were killing a mouse, he would know how to make it seem like a dragon. One feels, as with Napoleon, that he is fighting against destiny, that he can't win, and yet that he somehow deserves to. The attraction of such a pose is, of course, enormous. Half the films that one sees turn upon some such theme. We would call this the underdog story. Hitler is willing to fight the entire world. He can't win, but Orwell thinks that there's something admirable about the fact that he's willing to take on the entire world because he's mad at it. This brings us to the final paragraph, where Orwell's going to explain why people fell for Hitler. Also, he has grasped the falsity of the hedonistic attitude to life. Nearly all Western thought since the last war, certainly all progressive thought, has assumed tacitly that human beings desire nothing beyond ease, security, and avoidance of pain. In such a view of life, there is no room, for instance, for patriotism and the military virtues. The socialist who finds his children playing with soldiers is usually upset, but he is never able to think of a substitute for the tin soldiers. Tin pacifists somehow won't do. Hitler, because in his own joyless mind he feels it with exceptional strength, knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and, in general, common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. However they may be as economic theories, fascism and Nazism are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. The same is probably true of Stalin's militarized version of socialism. All three of the great dictators have enhanced their power by imposing intolerable burdens on their peoples. Whereas socialism, and even capitalism in a more grudging way, have said to people, "I offer you a good time," Hitler has said to them, "I offer you struggle, danger, and death." And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. Perhaps later on they will get sick of it and change their minds, as at the end of the last war. After a few years of slaughter and starvation, greatest happiness of the greatest number is a good slogan. But at this moment, better an end with horror than a horror without end is a winner. Now that we are fighting against the man who coined it, we ought not to underrate its emotional appeal. Think about a few of these points. The falsity of the hedonistic attitude to life, the view that human beings simply want ease, security, and avoidance of pain, the view that we only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and, in general, common sense. We should see a problem with this view of human nature when we watch children play with toys. Little boys don't want to play with toy pacifists or toy college students sitting in safe spaces. In my days, we played with toy guns, G.I. Joes, Transformers, He-Man, Thundercats, Voltron. Everything was about fighting. So there's an important part of human nature that's either ignored or repressed by certain ideologies. It's the part of us that wants struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. Because this too is part of our nature, ideologies that acknowledge this part of us and take advantage of it are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. So, whereas socialism and even capitalism in a more grudging way have said to people, "I offer you a good time," Hitler has said to them, "I offer you struggle, danger, and death." And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. Notice, here in the United States, much of the political conflict right now has to do with socialism and capitalism. And the dispute is supposedly about which economic theory will provide the best outcome for the most people. But what if that's not the real reason for the coming crisis? What if the real reason we're fighting over this is not that too many people are suffering and so we need a change? What if the real reason we're fighting over this is that we're all too comfortable and so we're looking for a fight? I mentioned in the beginning that the United States of America is the most powerful, most prosperous nation the world has ever seen. But think about the problem this creates. Progress is built into the fabric of the country. The country is designed to be improved, guaranteeing people's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, guaranteeing freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to protest, freedom to petition the government, freedom to choose our leaders. This is a recipe for progress. You can start out with all kinds of injustices in society, but as long as you're allowed to call out the injustices and report on them and protest them and demand change and vote for leaders who will make the changes you want, you can make constant progress. You can start with slavery and put an end to slavery. You can start with women not being allowed to vote and then change the law. You can have racial segregation and then racial integration. But notice what happens. If your society is making constant progress in dealing with these major injustices, then the injustices you have to fight over are constantly being reduced. The better things get, the less there is to fight about. But we still want to fight. It's part of our nature. And so we have to fight over lesser things. As the most powerful nation in the world, we don't face a significant external threat. So we have to find a significant internal threat. If we can't find a significant internal threat, we'll magnify an insignificant internal threat until it becomes the greatest threat in the history of humanity. We used to fight over slavery and segregation. Now we have to fight over using the wrong gender pronoun. We used to fight against Nazis who were putting Jews into ovens. Now we fight against a Christian baker who doesn't want to put a wedding cake into an oven. If we can't find an actual soldier to fight, we'll find a statue of a soldier to fight. If we can't find an actual hate crime, we'll fabricate a hate crime. But whatever happens, we will fight. We can see it all around us. If Orwell is right, there's a part of you that wants all the fighting to stop so you can go on living comfortably with a booming economy. But there's also a part of you that wants to rally around anyone who promises to crush the opposition. We need to be aware of this fact about ourselves, because there's no shortage of leaders who would love to take advantage of it.